The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order by Samuel Phillips Huntington. Chapter 4: The Fading of the West: Power, Culture, and Indigenization. Which of these two contrasting pictures of the place of the West in the world describes reality? The answer, of course, is they both do. The West is overwhelmingly dominant now and will remain number one in terms of power and influence well into the 21st century. Gradual, inexorable, and fundamental changes, however, are also occurring in the balances of power among civilizations, and the power of the West relative to that of other civilizations will continue to decline. As the West's primacy erodes, much of its power will simply evaporate and the rest will be diffused on a regional basis among the several major civilizations and their core states. The most significant increases in power are accruing and will accrue to Asian civilizations, with China gradually emerging as the society most likely to challenge the West for global influence. These shifts in power among civilizations are leading and will lead to revival and increased cultural assertiveness of non-Western societies and to their increasing rejection of Western culture. The decline of the West has three major characteristics. First, it is a slow process. The rise of Western power took 400 years. Its recession could take as long. In the 1980s, the distinguished British scholar Hadley Bull argued that European or Western dominance of the universal international society may be said to have reached its apogee about the year 1900. Spengler's first volume appeared in 1918, and the decline of the West has been a central theme in 20th century history. The process itself has stretched out through most of the century. Conceivably, however, it could accelerate. Economic growth and other increases in a country's capabilities often produced along an S curve. A slow start, then rapid acceleration followed by reduced rates of expansion and leveling off. The decline of countries may also occur along a reverse S curve, as it did with the Soviet Union. Moderate at first, then rapidly increasing before bottoming out. The decline of the West is still in the slow first phase, but at some point it might speed up dramatically. Second, decline does not proceed in a straight line. It is highly irregular with pauses, reversals, and reassertions of Western power following manifestations of Western weakness. The open democratic societies of the West have great capabilities for renewal. In addition, unlike many civilizations, the West has had two major centers of power. The decline which Bull saw starting about 1900 was essentially the decline of the European component of Western civilization. From 1910 to 1945, Europe was divided against itself and preoccupied with its internal economic, social, and political problems. In the 1940s, however, the American phase of Western domination began, and in 1945, the United States briefly dominated the world to an extent almost comparable to the combined Allied powers in 1918. Post-war decolonization further reduced European influence but not that of the United States, which substituted a new transnational imperialism for the traditional territorial empire. During the Cold War, however, American military power was matched by that of the Soviets and American economic power declined relative to that of Japan. Yet, periodic efforts at military and economic renewal did occur. In 1991, indeed, another distinguished British scholar, Barry Buzan, argued that the deeper reality is that the center is now more dominant and the periphery more subordinate than at any other time since the decolonization began. The accuracy of that perception, however, fades as the military victory that gave rise to it also fades into history. Third, the power is the ability of one person or group to change the behavior of another person or group. Behavior may be changed through inducement, coercion, or exhortation, which require the power wielder to have economic, military, institutional, demographic, political, technological, social, or other resources. The power of a state or group is hence normally estimated by measuring the resources it has at the disposal against those of the other states or groups it is trying to influence. The West's share of most, but not all, of the important power resources peaked early in the 20th century and then began to decline relative to those of other civilizations. Territory and population. In 1490, Western societies controlled most of the European peninsula outside the Balkans, or perhaps 1.5 million square miles out of a global land area apart from Antarctica, of 52.5 million square miles. At the peak of its territorial expansion in 1920, the West directly ruled about 25.5 million square miles or close to half the Earth's Earth. By 1993, this territorial control had been cut in half to about 12.7 million square miles. The West was back to its original European core plus its spacious settler populated lands in North America, Australia, and New Zealand. The territory of independent Islamic societies, in contrast, rose from 1.8 million square miles in 1920 to over 11 million square miles in 1993. Similar changes occurred in the control of population. In 1900, Westerners composed roughly 30% of the world's population, and Western governments ruled almost 45% of that population, then, and 48% in 1920. In 1993, except for a few small imperial remnants like Hong Kong, Western governments ruled no one but Westerners. Westerners amounted to slightly over 13% of humanity and are due to drop to about 11% early in the next century and to 10% by 2025. In terms of total population in 1993, the West ranked fourth behind Sunni, Islamic, and Hindu civilizations. Quantitatively, Westerners thus constitute a steadily decreasing minority of world's population. Quantitatively, the balance between the West and other populations is also changing. Non-Western peoples are becoming healthier, more urban, more literate, better educated. By the early 1990s, infant mortality rates in Latin America, Africa and the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia and Southeast Asia were 1/3 to 1/2 what they had been 30 years earlier. Life expectancy in these regions had increased significantly, with gains varying from 11 years in Africa to 23 years in East Asia. In the early 1960s, in most of the third world, less than 1/3 of the adult population was literate. In the early 1990s, in very few countries apart from Africa was less than one half of population literate. About 50% of Indians and 75% of Chinese could read and write. Literacy rates in developing countries in 1970 averaged 41% of those in developed countries. In 1992, they averaged 71%. By the early 1990s, in every region except Africa, virtually the entire age group was enrolled in primary education. Most significantly, in the early 1960s in Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa, less than one third of the appropriate age group was enrolled in secondary education. By early 1990s, one half of the age group was enrolled except in Africa. In 1960, urban residents made up less than one quarter of the population of the less developed world. Between 1960 and 1992, however, the urban percentage of population rose from 49% to 73% in Latin America, 34% to 55% in Arab countries, 14% to 29% in Africa, 18% to 27% in China, and 19% to 26% in India. These shifts in literacy, education, and urbanization created socially mobilized populations with enhanced capabilities and higher expectations, who could be activated for political purposes in ways in which illiterate peasants could not. Socially mobilized societies are more powerful societies. In 1953, when less than 15% of Iranians were literate and less than 17% urban, Kermit Roosevelt and a few CIA operatives rather easily suppressed an insurgency and restored the Shah to his throne. In 1979, when 50% of Iranians were literate and 47% lived in the cities, no amount of US military power could have kept the Shah on the throne. A significant gap still separates Chinese, Indians, Arabs, and Africans from Westerners, Japanese, and Russians. Yet the gap is narrowing rapidly. At the same time, a different gap is opening. The average ages of Westerners, Japanese, and Russians are increasingly steadily, and the larger population of the population that no longer works imposes a mounting burden on those still productively employed. Other civilizations are burdened by large numbers of children, but children are future workers and soldiers. Economic product. The Western share of the global economic product also may have peaked in the 1920s and has clearly been declining since World War II. In 1750, China accounted for almost one third, India for almost one quarter, and the West for less than a fifth of the world's manufacturing output. By 1830, the West had pulled slightly ahead of China. In the following decades, as Paul Bairoch points out, the industrialization of the West led to the deindustrialization of the rest of the world. In 1930, the manufacturing output of non-Western countries was roughly two-thirds what it had been in 1800. Beginning in the mid-19th century, the Western share rose dramatically, peaking in 1928 at 84.2% of world manufacturing output. Thereafter, the West's share declined as its rate of growth remained modest and as less industrialized countries expanded their output rapidly after World War II. By 1980, the West accounted for 57.8% of global manufacturing output, roughly the share it had 120 years earlier in 1860s. Reliable data on the gross economic product are not available for the pre-World War II period. In the 1950s, however, the West accounted for roughly 64% of the gross world product. By the 1980s, this proportion had dropped to 49%. See table 4.5. By 2013, according to one estimate, the West will account for only 30% of world product. In 1991, according to another estimate, 4 of the world's 7 largest economies belonged to non-Western nations. Japan in the second place, China third, Russia sixth, and India seventh. In 1992, the United States had the largest economy in the world, and the top 10 economies included those of 5 Western countries plus the leading states of 5 other civilizations: China, Japan, India, Russia, and Brazil. In 2020, plausible projections indicate that the top 5 economies will be in 5 different civilizations, and the top 10 economies will include only 3 Western countries. This relative decline of the West is, of course, in large part a function of the rapid rise of East Asia. Gross figures on economic output partially obscured the West's qualitative advantage. The West and Japan almost totally dominate advanced technology industries. Technologies are being disseminated, however, and if the West wishes to maintain its superiority, it will do what it can to minimize that dissemination. Thanks to the interconnected world which the West has created, however, slowing the diffusion of technology to other civilizations is increasingly difficult. It is made all the more so in the absence of a single overpowering agreed upon threat, such as existed during the Cold War and gave measures of technology control some modest effectiveness. It appears probable that for most of history, China has the world's largest economy. The diffusion of technology and the economic development of non-Western societies in the second half of the 20th century are now producing a return to the historical pattern. This will be a slow process, but by the middle of the 21st century, if not before, the distribution of economic product and manufacturing output among the leading civilizations is likely to resemble that of 1800. The 200-year Western blip on the world economy will be over. Military capability. Military power has 4 dimensions. Quantitative, the number of men, weapons, equipment, and resources. Technological, the effectiveness and sophistication of weapons and equipment. Organizational, the coherence, discipline, training, and morale of the troops, and the effectiveness of command and control relationships. And societal, the ability and willingness of the society to apply military force effectively. In the 1920s, the West was far ahead of everyone else in all these dimensions. In the years since, the military power of the West has declined relative to that of other civilizations. A decline reflected in the shifting balance in military personnel, one measure, although clearly not the most important one, of military capability. Modernization and economic development generate the resources and desire for the states to develop their military capabilities, and few states failed to do so. In the 1930s, Japan and the Soviet Union created very powerful military forces as they demonstrated in World War II. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union had one of the world's two most powerful military forces. Currently, the West monopolizes the ability to deploy substantial conventional military forces anywhere in the world. Whether it will continue to maintain that capability is uncertain. It seems reasonably certain, however, that no non-Western state or group of states will create a comparable capability during the coming decades. Overall, the years after the Cold War have been dominated by five major trends in the evolution of global military capabilities. First, the armed forces of the Soviet Union ceased to exist shortly after the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Apart from Russia, only Ukraine inherited significant military capabilities. Russian forces were greatly reduced in size and were withdrawn from Central Europe and the Baltic states. The Warsaw Pact ended. The goal of challenging the United States Navy was abandoned. Military equipment was either disposed of or allowed to deteriorate and become non operational. Budget allocations for defense were drastically reduced. Demoralization pervaded the ranks of both officers and men. At the same time, the Russian military were redefining their missions and doctrine and reconstructing themselves for their new roles in protecting Russians and dealing with regional conflicts in the near abroad. Second, the precipitous reduction in Russian military capabilities stimulated a slower but significant decline in Western military spending, forces, and capabilities. Under the plans of the Bush and Clinton administrations, US military spending was due to drop by 35% from $342.3 billion 1994 dollars in 1990 to $222.3 billion in 1998. The force structure that year would be half to two-thirds what it was at the end of the Cold War. Total military personnel would go down from 2.5 million to 1.4 million. Many major weapons programs have been and are being cancelled. Between 1985 and 1995, annual purchases of major weapons went down from 29 to 6 ships, 943 to 127 aircrafts, 720 to 0 tanks, and 48 to 18 strategic missiles. Beginning in the late 1980s, Britain, Germany, and to a lesser degree France went through similar reductions in defense spending and military capabilities. In the mid-1990s, the German armed forces were scheduled to decline from 370,000 to 340,000 and probably to 320,000. The French army was to drop from its strength of 290,000 in 1990 to 225,000 in 1997. British military personnel went down from 377,100 in 1985 to 274,800 in 1993. Continental members of NATO also shortened terms of conscripted service and debated the possible abandonment of conscription. Third, the trends in East Asia differed significantly from those in Russia and in the West. Increased military spending and force improvements were the order of the day. China was the pace setter. stimulated by both their increasing economic wealth and the Chinese build-up. Other East Asian nations are modernizing and expanding their military forces. Japan has continued to improve its highly sophisticated military capability. Taiwan, South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia all are spending more on their military and purchasing planes, tanks, and ships from Russia, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and other countries. While NATO defense expenditures declined by roughly 10% between 1985 and 1993, from 539.6 billion US dollars to 485 billion US dollars, constant 1993 dollars. Expenditures in East Asia rose by 50% from 89.8 billion US dollars to 134.8 billion during the same period. Fourth, military capabilities, including weapons of mass destruction, are diffusing broadly across the world. As countries develop economically, they generate the capability to produce weapons. Between the 1960s and 1980s, for instance, the number of third world countries producing fighter aircrafts increased from 1 to 8, tanks from 1 to 6, helicopters from 1 to 6, and tactical missiles from none to 7. The 1990s have seen a major trend toward the globalization of the defense industry, which is likely further to erode Western military advantages. Many non-Western societies either have nuclear weapons, Russia, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, and possibly North Korea, or have been making strenuous efforts to acquire them, Iran, Iraq, Libya, and possibly Algeria, or are placing themselves in a position quickly to acquire them if they see the need to do so, Japan. Finally, all those developments make regionalization the central trend in military strategy and power in the post-Cold War world. Regionalization provides the rationale for the reductions in Russian and Western military forces and for increases in the military forces of other states. Russia no longer has a global military capability but is focusing its strategy and forces on the near abroad. China has reoriented its strategy and forces to emphasize local power projection and the defense of Chinese interests in East Asia. European countries are similarly redirecting their forces through both NATO and the Western European Union to deal with instability on the periphery of Western Europe. The United States has explicitly shifted its military planning from deterring and fighting the Soviet Union on a global basis to preparing to deal simultaneously with regional contingencies in the Persian Gulf and Northeast Asia. The United States, however, is not likely to have the military capability to meet these goals. To defeat Iraq, United States deployed in the Persian Gulf 75% of its active tactical aircraft, 42% of its modern battle tanks, 46% of its aircraft carriers, 37% of its army personnel, and 46% of its marine personnel. With significantly reduced forces in the future, the United States will be hard put to carry out one intervention, much less two, against substantial regional powers outside the Western Hemisphere. Military security throughout the world increasingly depends not on the global distribution of power and the actions of superpowers, but on the distribution of power within each region of the world and the actions of the core states of civilizations. In sum, overall, the West will remain the most powerful civilization well into the early decades of the 21st century. Beyond then, it will probably continue to have a substantial lead in scientific talent, research and development capabilities, and civilian and military technological innovation. Control over the other power resources, however, is becoming increasingly dispersed among the core states and leading countries of non-Western civilizations. The West's control of these resources peaked in the 1920s and has since been declining irregularly but significantly. In the 2020s, 100 years after that peak, the West will probably control about 24% of world's territory, down from a peak of 49%. 10% of the total world population, down from 48%, and perhaps 15 to 20% of the socially mobilized population, about 30% of world's economic product, down from the peak of probably 70%. Perhaps 25% of manufacturing output, down from a peak of 84%, and less than 10% of global military manpower, down from 45%. In 1919, Woodrow Wilson, Lloyd George, and Georges Clemenceau together virtually controlled the world. Sitting in Paris, they determined what countries would exist and which would not, what new countries would be created, what their boundaries would be, and who would rule them, and how the Middle East and other parts of the world would be divided up among the victorious powers. They also decided on military intervention in Russia and economic concessions to be extracted from China. 100 years later, no small group of statesmen will be able to exercise comparable power. To the extent that any group does, it will not consist of three Westerners but leaders of the core states of the world's 7 or 8 major civilizations. The successors to Reagan, Thatcher, Mitterrand, and Kohl will be rivaled by those of Deng Xiaoping, Nekosuna, Indira Gandhi, Yeltsin, Khomeini, and Suharto. The age of Western dominance will be over. In the meantime, the fading of the West and the rise of other power centers is promoting the global processes of indigenization and the resurgence of non-Western cultures.